Joining us live in studio, Deva Mavinga, Human Rights Watch representative. Mawethu Nkosana Nkoloba is a Research and Communications Officer with Human Rights Institute of South Africa. In fact, we joined by Gashaw Brooks, South African Human Rights Commission spokesperson, and Walter Lukhuleni is a PAC Secretary of Publicity and Information. The lines are always open to you. Gentlemen, good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us. You know, somebody was saying, you know, it's in bad taste when you say Happy Human Rights Day, because when you look at the strides that have been made and the fact that human rights in itself is a compromise from the Sharpeville Day or the commemoration of the events of 21st March 1960. We'll start with you, Walter, from the PAC, what your reflections are.
Thanks for having me. I think you are correct. You cannot have a happy Human Rights Day because it's a day on which we should be reflecting on the lost lives and also taking stock of the strides that we've made. And as the PAC will tell you that we are seeing in 2017 baby steps in the government of the ANC beginning to realize what the struggle was all about, accepting that the PAC played a role. It's baby steps. Maybe we believe that with our engagement with them, these steps would leap and become giant steps in the future. But also, as I was walking in Sharpeville today, it's the same Sharpeville that I saw as a young man. And it's the same Sharpeville that people were, when they were killed, was the same. You know, the streets are still untarred in certain areas, there's still potholes, there's still matchbox houses, and the ruling party says they've delivered houses, they've delivered even smaller matchboxes, I don't know what to call them now. You know, the more we go forward, we're going backwards. You know, so basically in 2017, it's an indictment on the ruling party that 23 years later, the changes are so minimal that you struggle. You know, if Robert Sobukwe was to wake up today and walk the streets, you would be surprised that there has been no change. You know.
I mean, I think it was David Makura, Premier of Gauteng, who said that human rights needs to be it shouldn't be apolitical football, as it were, because, you know, everybody needs to participate in it. We need to see the different diverse cultures participating in these commemoration, and that's not always the case, Gashaw. But why do you think that certain race groups rather avoid going to these national events?
Good evening to you, Cindy. Well, and to the people at home, of course. Look, I think it's something that very important, and I think that if we're going to limit the analysis around how we view days like Human Rights Day, and we're just going to look at it from a perspective of race, then we're going to shortchange ourselves. I think we need to look at it from a perspective of class. We have to look at it other sort of strata that we have within society. And the reason why I say that it's so important to look at it holistically is because I think that the younger generation is starting to lose touch with these things and what is the importance of a Human Rights Day, for example. It's for people that emerge out of apartheid, people that understand why human rights are so important, because they were denied human rights in the first instance. A lot of people were born into having human rights, and that is why there might be a slight disconnect in terms of that. But I think that it's a far broader debate in terms of why is it so important. And again, I think it's something that I've been saying quite often on behalf of the Commission, is the fact that there's a serious disconnect between what is in Chapter 2 of our Bill of Rights, of our Constitution, versus how people interpret it and live it, and how it impacts on their lives on a day-to-day basis. And
I mean, we're not talking necessarily about the intangible values of the human rights charter, if you will, in terms of, you know, you have the right of association and all sorts of things, but it's whether the quality of life of people has changed to appreciate those very rights. And I don't know, Deva, if in your research that is reflected adequately to say, yes, baby steps or small steps were taken to ensure that everybody enjoys the human rights, but greater strides need to be made.
Yeah, absolutely, and to acknowledge that South Africa is one of the best or most progressive constitutions in the world in terms of human rights provisions, but it is the implementation that remains a challenge. We have researched and established that some 500,000 children with disabilities are out of school, for example. So this is an area that needs, decisive leadership from the government, a provision of resources, and a comprehensive action plan to ensure that no child is left out or is left behind. We have had cases like the Marikana massacre. We have had cases like the life Esidimeni crisis, and more recently the social grants crisis, which threatened to put in disarray the rights of some 17 million South Africans who depend on social grants. So all these things indicate the need for the government to continue to provide leadership in terms of ensuring the progressive realization of socio-economic rights, but also to say all the rights should be promoted and protected in a manner that says they are interconnected and interrelated.
Yeah, but I think it's this Biki mere kind of provisions or concessions that were made in the Constitution and the fact that we started with reconciliation before we could deal with issues of economical disparities. And I don't know if we have the luxury of time to take another 360 years of what colonialism and apartheid had done to bring us to where we are today to rectify the situation. Why do you think it's a government approach that should be blamed in the lackluster advancements that have been made in creating an equal society?
In terms of socio-economic rights, Cindy, you will never have a situation whereby just suddenly, you can turn people from poverty into sort of living happy middle-class lives. No matter what economic and political model you use, it's not just going to happen overnight. And that is why the Constitution specifically makes provision for the progressive realization of rights. So whether we're looking at education, anything that's socio-economic in nature, health, housing, etc., yes, it is matchbox houses, and it is an indictment to a large extent that we still build townships outside of the workspaces of people. I mean, and that's just a fact. We see it geographically as we lay out our various cities, that is what the setup is at the moment. However, those people would not have had a home to live in, at the other end. Apart from that, how do you then, when you have so many people, and if you look around Johannesburg, for example, you look at how many people are actually, dispossessed of property, how many people are homeless. How do you get those people from being homeless into a home? And so therefore, yes, it will take time. But yes, there is a need for speedy delivery, and we've seen a serious lack in that particular space.
All right, let's take a caller. Johannes in Joburg, thanks for calling. Good evening to you.
Good evening, I'm Johannes from Soweto.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I want to comment on this. First, I want to correct this thing firstly. I'm not happy by calling this day Human Rights Day. It remains Self-Day Day like Soweto uprising. Secondly, I'm not happy about the way the people of Soweto have been treated. Look, South-Bay, there is no development compared to Soweto. Soweto is how developed, everything is there. You see, I don't know the people who hijacked the Pan-African struggle and the BCM struggle of 1976. The ANC failed the black people. You cannot correct everything now because it's Self-Day and say you have to talk about this.
All right,
it won't be like that.
Yes,
what
sir.
you expect from the white people? They want a reconcile with black people. You are wasting our time. Mandela tried to reconcile with white people, they fail. It's only blacks who keep on going to the and say, let's come together and build country. They won't.
Yeah, no, that's why the argument is that, black people need to be innovative and, come up with our own systems, institutions, etc. But I get your point. Thanks so much for calling us, Johannes. Albertina, good evening to you.
Good evening. Cindy, for us to celebrate or commemorate the human rights, somebody has to recognize that I'm a human first. Until we face up to the people who killed the people in Sharpeville, those people must apologize first. Now we're celebrating, they're not there. They didn't say they are sorry to start with. And our Human Rights Commission put South Africans last always. If an incident happens to a South African, they always last on the list. But if things happen to other nationalities in our country, the human rights is the first to look after those. Who are we? Are we recognized that we suffered in our country, or are we still lost even today?
Yeah, Albertine, are you referring to settlers or maybe the colonialists in the fact that they got away with impunity, if you like, and the Human Rights Commission is limited in redressing?
The human rights doesn't do anything for us, South Africans. They are here to look at us, at our interests, but they are always putting us last.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much, Albertina. We'll get Mawethu Nkosana Nkolomba to give a response to that. Good evening to you, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Just with the last caller saying that she feels neglected, if you will, in terms of the protection of human rights of primarily Black South Africans.
So I mean, I'm from an institution which is an NGO, and basically, I think most of the work we do is NGO-led work, which is to capacitate citizens all over South Africa with human rights knowledge, but beyond that, to also make them be able to access their own human rights. So I also do feel like there are, of course, like inherent human rights education problems within the South African context. And there's a lot of violations, gross human rights violations that occur. So I mean, just very recently we had the coffin assault, but beyond that we have a lot of various other human rights violations or occurrences within the country. And I do feel like, so a lot of South Africans, as much as human rights have been itself a buzzword, a lot of South Africans still do not understand what human rights mean, firstly. In the instance they do, there's also not much education, both from the government and I think just for also civil society and other multi-stakeholders in terms of how do we then access these institutions to seek for legal recourse, especially within the human rights domain. So I'm two-sided, I think, with what the caller is saying. Partly, yes, maybe there is a general, I think, inadherence from state in terms of protecting the general citizens' human rights. And perhaps the Limpopo case study would be, a very one to centralize or to put in front the idea that almost half of the population in Limpopo is unemployed, right? When we've been almost in this new dispensation for 23 years, and there were ideals and treaties that government ratified. Some of them are regional and some of them are international, which were to ensure that would never get into, I think, such a situation at this time frame. So yes, I feel like in terms of a lot of South Africans accessing their basic human rights, and my answer to that would be no, right? Because I deal with a lot of South Africans who are from marginalized communities.
Yeah, Mawethu, we'll get back to you. Sorry, I just want to get a panelist to also respond to that how do we take the debate forward as opposed to regurgitating essentially the fact that very little has changed and more needs to be done with limited resources and maybe a lack of a political will in expediting the progress towards a more equal society?
Well, Cindy, the reality is that colonialism and apartheid were social engineering projects. When the settlers came here, they changed the landscape of Africa as a whole. But if we confine ourselves to South Africa, we will find that 90% of the townships are based in the southwest of the city center. And it needed a social engineering project because you cannot reform apartheid. What needed to have happened is that even if the government was saying they have limited resources, they can't provide better than matchboxes, build them in the northern suburbs. Those guys who are in the northern suburbs who want to buy houses, let them buy land in the townships so that they face the sun in the morning as they go to work and they face the sun in the evening as they come back to work. Then the realization will come. Because as things stand, the policy of gradualism, the policy of reconciliation doesn't work. In actual fact, you are coming cap in hand, begging your oppressor to accept you at his table.
Yeah, but to deconstruct all of that, as you were saying, is going to take, perhaps a generation or two. In the immediate, do you call for stricter or greater policy reforms, or what needs to? Immediately,
what you need to do is to change the laws. Firstly, you need to say that government will not build government subsidized houses in the townships. those houses will go to the suburbs. That needs a change of law. It doesn't need rocket science. Secondly, what you need to go to the level of saying, not only decriminalize racism, but have stricter penalties for those people.
And I mean, I want to look at the paradigm, sorry, Kasho, with Helen Zille now praising colonialism in the fact that it depends on which side of the fence you are or how you experience colonialism and apartheid, that the black experience is not necessarily appreciated or given enough significance to deal with the social issues that we face today. There's a level of victim mentality on the greater white populace that denies the benefits of apartheid and colonialism, and thus we see the attitude of the likes of Madam Zille. So how do we move forward to ensure again that egalitarian ideal if we're not willing to say I've benefited and therefore it's almost morally obligated to give more?
Look, I mean, that's a very interesting question that you're asking there. How do we get people to be egalitarian and them coming forward and saying, let me help out in building this thing that we call this country called South Africa, right? And unfortunately, yeah, it is very correct. Maybe you need policies and you need laws to enact that, right? But I think that the biggest myth that we perpetuate is this idea that it's the laws that is actually scuppering this whole process. It's not the laws, it's not law that says that you're going to build matchbox houses in townships or on the outskirts of of the CBD. It's not the law that says that. This is, again, a situation whereby we need to, first of all, people need to understand that the Constitution, the very thing that we're celebrating or that we're remembering today, those human rights, give us the opportunity to hold our leadership to account and to say to our politicians it's not good enough to chuck us on the outskirts of the various towns. That's the first point. The second point is also issues of land, redistribution of wealth. All of those things are dealt with.
I disagree, Kasho, because I think bylaws and laws generally, I'll give you an example in terms of the radius of which school you can send your child to. So if you're 5 kilometers away, then you're sort of included in that community. Anything external is not permissible. So which means, in effect, if you want to go to a more affluent area, your children can't go based on these false parameters that have been put there.
But the key question that we have to ask ourselves, why, when we talk about state schools, do we still talk about affluent versus non-affluent schools? Surely by now we should have held our leadership to account to say that if I'm sending my child to a state school, that the quality of education that they're going to get in Alexandra is the exact same quality of education that they should get in Sandown.
No, but what if I want to send my child to Sandton and I live in Alexandra?
No, that's fine. But I mean, that is a different debate altogether, because then we're talking about freedom of movement and association and all those things. But what I'm saying is the fundamental reason for why people are sending their kids to Sandown as opposed to Alex is because I'm going to get a better education, and quality of education in Sandown. Whereas in Alex, whether the teacher's in class or having affairs with 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds, which is the most egregious form of abuse, it's acceptable and fine, and we live with this on a day-to-day basis. That, for me, is the concern. The Constitution should be used as a means of holding people to account.
Devan, your response?
Absolutely agree that the Constitution provides that basis, and that the government should be a facilitator. The point that has been raised around land reform, for example, is that you do not need to wait for a crisis to begin to address those issues. You need to have a framework of the rule of law, you have the right institutions, and within the Human Rights Foundation, begin to address and bring all stakeholders on board. Because if you wait, look, what happened with Zimbabwe's land reform is not what South Africa should be going towards. But if there is no resolution on time, you would end up with a chaotic process that results in more violations of human rights, food insecurity, and that destroys the fabric upon which we're saying the foundation of South Africa is a strong constitution.
How different is Human Rights Day going to be next year if we're still wrestling with who the authentic name belongs to, whether it should be Sharpeville Day, whether it's a PAC prerogative, or whether it's a government, how different is Human Rights Day going to be next year?
Well, Cindy, I'm afraid we are going to have the same situation, simply because the ruling party is not willing to accept that other people participated in the struggle. They want to appropriate the right to be the number one, and they will give you space, but certain space limited because the narrative is that we liberated you. That is how they're getting their votes. And if the narrative changes to say, but there are other people who are involved, it becomes a problem. So the policy, their policy will always remain that other parties should be marginalized. For example, today, the president of the country goes into Ginsberg to go and honor Steve Biko. Steve Biko, yes, should be honored, but Steve Biko was killed on the 12th of September. That's the day that we should honor him. But simply because this day, for him to honor the PAC would be anathema. So the only way is to deflect the attention to another area. But secondly, this is why they do it, because also you can't go and honor the departed in a different place. You're supposed to go to their graves. Exactly what he did with Steve Biko should have been done in Sharpeville. For me, the commemoration of Sharpeville, whether you call it human rights or you call it Sharpeville Day, is immaterial, but should happen in Sharpeville. So that even the international people should see the difference that is happening as we speak. That is not happening.
All right.